I am doing the narrative paradigm theory, which is all about storytelling and why it is important to us as a society and how we communicate through stories. This theory was created by Walter Fisher in 1984. Walter Fisher was born in Honolulu, Hawaii, in 1931, which, yeah, that's cool. He's from Hawaii. He recently died in July this year, July 26th. He had a Bachelor of Arts and Master of Arts from San Diego State University in speech and communication, and he also got a doctorate or PhD, I'm sorry, from the University of Iowa in 1960. After he received his PhD, he went on to teach, and in 1965 he joined the University of Southern California Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and this is where he was there when he came up with the theory. So, narrative paradigm, kind of broken down into two words. A narrative is telling a story, and when someone tells a story, it's most likely from their point of view as they're telling it. And then a paradigm is the way that people see the world around them and how they explain that view to others. So, Fisher created this theory because he believes that people are storytellers. Everybody is a storyteller in their own way. He actually says that we should be called Homo narrans instead of Homo sapiens because everything we do is part of storytelling, and that's how we communicate as a society and how we pass down information to generations. As part of his theory, he proposed a shift from a rational world paradigm to a narrative paradigm. And a rational world paradigm is a scientific or philosophical approach to knowledge that assumes people are logical, making decisions. People are logical and make decisions on the basis of evidence and lines of argument. And then a narrative paradigm is a theoretical framework that views narrative as the basis of all human communication. And the reason he suggested we change from a rational world paradigm to a narrative paradigm is because he believes that the rational world paradigm is too narrow, and that the narrative paradigm offers a broader view of the world. Now, there are two different components of a narrative. There are narrative coherence and narrative fidelity. And narrative fidelity is when the story makes sense and the facts of the story are meaningful and consistent. And then narrative fidelity is when the story is believable and can be compared to real life, and the audience tests it to see if what is being said is true and accurate. And then underneath narrative coherence, there are three subsections of that to determine if what is being said is coherent. So the first point under that is, under narrative coherence, is structure. The structure of a story is important because if your story has no direction, has no structure to it, it's not going to make any sense. You can't tell a story out of order. You can't, if you tell the middle before the beginning, and people are confused and don't know where you're at or what you're doing. There are ways to tell a story out of chronological order, but even when you're telling it out of chronological order, there's still a structure to it. So if you have no structure, you have no direction, it's not going to make any sense. The second point is there needs to be a resemblance between stories. So if you're telling a series of stories, or you tell the same story a couple different times, if you tell it a different way every time, or if story A doesn't line up with story B, or part one doesn't line up with part two, then people are going to start to question your credibility as a narrator, as a storyteller, and they're going to start poking holes in what you're saying because your thoughts don't line up. Also, if you leave out details in a story, people will try to fill in the blanks for themselves. And you don't really want them to do that because then what you're trying to communicate, what you're trying to get across, gets lost and they just put in their own thoughts. And not that having your own thoughts is a bad thing, but you want to know what you're talking about, so and just assume that the audience doesn't know, so that you give them all the information necessary to understand what you're trying to say. And then the third point under narrative coherence is that your characters in your story need to have credibility. They need to make sense in the world that you've created for them. You can't, and you don't want to give them personality traits that don't line up with what you've already established. Like in Superman, for example, if he wasn't established in his world, if it wasn't established in Superman's world that there are aliens, then no one would understand who he is, and people would be confused why there's this random man that can do all these things. But because in the comics they established that there is an alien planet and he came from there, then all of the things that he can do, shooting lasers and all of that, makes sense, and your character has your development has some credibility because you've established where he's come from. And then the next point under the two components of a narrative. The first was narrative coherence. The second is narrative fidelity. And there are 5 different components under narrative fidelity. They are how you're going to determine narrative fidelity. There are are the events described really factual? Have the facts been distorted while narrating? What are the reasoning patterns followed while narrating? How does the argument in the story affect the decision-making of the listener? And how is the importance of the story being narrated? So, the first step in determining narrative fidelity is asking, are the events described really factual? Your audience is going to listen to what you say, and they're going to analyze it and make sure what you're saying it makes sense. Or if they're reading, they'll take what you've written and they'll go look it up and figure out if what you're saying is actually true. And if it's not, then you're going to lose some credibility. The second thing is, have the facts been distorted while narrating? Once again, they're going to look at what you're saying and is it true, is it not true? And if it is true, but you've kind of, fudged it a little bit, they're gonna be looking for that. The next thing is, what are the reasoning patterns followed while narrating? The audience is going to make sure what you're saying is coherent and makes sense and everything lines up. It's similar to testing the facts of they're testing your thought process and what you're saying. And then the next question is, how does the argument in the story affect the decision-making of the listener? They're going to determine what they think based off of what you say and how well you articulate it. They're going to be listening for any biases that you might have, because if you seem very biased in your opinion, they may be inclined to go the opposite direction and not agree with you, because people want a fair and balanced report of what you're saying, but that's not real life. Everybody has their own bias. And then the last question is, how are the important facts of the story being narrated? They want to know how you're presenting the facts And once again, if it's coherent, if it makes sense. Um, and then if if you're following all of these steps in your storytelling, it's you'll if you're telling the truth when you're telling a story and you know what you're talking about, um, then it will make sense. All of those questions will be answered and people will be okay with it, and you will keep your audience because people are always testing you and listening and trying to determine if what you're saying is true and if they can believe you or not.